knew you would come. My strength has left me.
Who are you?
I am Raziel.
What's up, you beautiful bastards? I know, I said in my last video about Final Fantasy XIV here that I was done making videos about what sucks about Final Fantasy XIV until a somewhat viral Reddit post from the MMORPG subreddit popped up on my feed.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
And I decided that I needed to address this once again. Now, despite what people may say, I get no pleasure out of shitting on this game. I quit Final Fantasy XIV at the end of Endwalker, and I quit raiding in the game after the first tier of Savage raiding in Shadowbringers. Having to pug via Party Finder every Savage raid since Heavensward does a number on you. Let me just tell you that much. But the question isn't why Final Fantasy XIV is dying and what's broken about it. I've told you the answer to these questions many times in many videos and in my live streams if you've watched anything on my channel. It's all the shit I talked about in those videos, and I'll touch on some of those things shortly, but the question is rather, why now is the Final Fantasy XIV community finally noticing these issues that I have shouted from the rooftops for years? And the answer is actually quite simple, because the main strength that Final Fantasy XIV always had in the genre is gone. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if you look at the MMO genre, and especially about the most popular ones right now, which is World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, Elder Scrolls Online, and of course Final Fantasy XIV, you will notice that one thing is consistent. Each game does one or two things much, much better than their competitors do. They each kind of have their own niche. For example, WoW's strongest point has always been its raiding experience. Its dungeon system, current season, which is absolute shit aside, is also a league above the rest. Guild Wars 2 and Elder Scrolls Online are in constant blows with each other with their PvP systems, each providing, different flavors of PvP for players that WoW simply really doesn't offer. Also, all three games have innovative and complex RPG elements, such as, talent systems that make your character unique or play slightly different than other players of the same class. But now, knowing all of this, let's take a look at Final Fantasy XIV. The raids are mediocre, a few and far in between. There's not that many. There's big lulls lately, even more than normal for content, which always consist of the exact same basic design and layout, and I'll explain that here. A single square or circle room with death walls that will simply kill you if you touch them, or there is no wall and you can just fall off, and there's definitely going to be a mechanic that can push you off during the fight, which insta-kills you as well. A series of overly complex mechanics that you need to memorize like a dance and execute flawlessly while also meeting a very strict DPS requirement. Now, I haven't raided in Elder Scrolls Online or Guild Wars 2, but I've watched them on YouTube, and those raids seem a little closer to WoW's fun and complexity level than Final Fantasy XIV does. So 14's strength definitely hasn't been its raiding, in my opinion. Okay, fine. So what about the dungeon content? Well, outside of the one time you run each dungeon for its story, they're mostly useless unless you're grinding tomestones for gear, which, by the way, the gear in this game is also completely worthless. A feat so retarded no other MMO can lay claim to it on the same level. But if you want to know more about why the gear is worthless in the game, watch the aforementioned video that I posted earlier. It's too much to go into more detail here, but I digress. For years, players of Final Fantasy XIV's community complained that they wanted challenging and meaningful 4-man dungeon content, and Square finally did deliver that more recently, but the execution was beyond poor. The dungeons were akin to Savage level rating difficulty-wise and were extremely punishing, but the reward was practically non-existent. So no one really does them, and once again, Square trivialized its own content the day it was released, a theme they have grown accustomed to in this game for some reason. Okay, so raiding and dungeons are not the strongest point. and small man content, like I just mentioned, is out. What about 14's PvP? Well, it's laughably dog shit and everyone knows it. This is due to many things, but regardless of how much they have attempted to fix it, it simply cannot be solved, in my opinion, because of the way the netcode and the server tick works in Final Fantasy XIV. It just isn't made for highly reactive activities that PvP requires. So, okay, now we boil down to the RPG elements and talent systems that I mentioned earlier in other games like WoW, ESO, Guild Wars 2, etc. Final Fantasy XIV has none. Absolutely fucking zero. In fact, the argument could be made that the jobs in 14 are the most homogenized class system in the entire genre. It has essentially become a game where everyone's a DPS with just a different colored class icon. So what is Final Fantasy XIV's strength that made it last so long and do so well? Especially during one of WoW's biggest lulls where it took a huge chunk of its player base. Simple. The story. Final Fantasy is known for its stories. Many people, myself included, played Final Fantasy XIV for its amazing and well-delivered narrative. Heavensward was peak for me, and while some expansions had stories that weren't quite as good, such as in Stormblood, every bit of the Hydaelyn/Zodiark arc was top-notch. It was definitely worth the cost of admission in the sub-feed during the times you were going through the story. However, now that the game is in its expansion Dawntrail and the story is, quite frankly, absolute shit, people no longer have the main thing that drew them into the game and kept them playing in the first place. In fact, I started to see the cracks in the systems and the writing on the wall when I started to notice that Square started directly importing stories and main characters and entire ideas and themes from other Final Fantasy games, even way back in near the end of Stormblood. This goes beyond things that are just part of the Final Fantasy universe that are in all Final Fantasy games, such as, characters like Shiva, Ifrit, the creatures like behemoths, and that sort of thing, and other Final Fantasy constants. But now Final Fantasy XIV is straight up lifting title characters for story ideas from other games, such as Golbez, the whole area of Ivalice, Kefka, and other such things. And while it was fun and definitely hit my nostalgia bone when those things were brought into the game, it's now gotten to the same state that the game systems I mentioned earlier have been in for a long time. Unchanged, tired, overdone, and boring as fuck. Now that the story is bad, 14 has lost the main niche and draw that it once had. Now all the systems that have not seen nearly any evolution since A Realm Reborn are starting to show their mundaneness and flaws and cracks to the general player base. And let me tell you, the awakening is something to behold. Let's just take a look at some of the responses on the aforementioned Reddit thread that I grabbed and go over them. Here's the initial post on the thread, and we'll read over that. Okay, so the title of the Reddit thread was Half a Year Later, Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail drops to mostly negative recent reviews. And let's read this. It wasn't even that long of a comment that started this whole thread. Most common complaints are lack of content, slow updates, and boring story. Some also complain about the casualization of classes and the devs being too scared to try something new. They have been using the same endgame formula for more than 10 years. As much as I respect Yoshi P, and nobody can deny that he saved the game, he is obviously too afraid to change the game's formula even after 10 years, so it might be time for somebody else to take over. So this is the initial Reddit post that got this entire viral thread started on the MMORPG subreddit. And I don't so much think Yoshi P is scared as it is that he's kind of pigeonholed into what he has at this point. And I am wagering either him or the company doesn't want him to take any risks. But here's the rub here. The boring story hits hardest of all because, honestly, lack of content and slow updates have kind of always been Final Fantasy XIV's forte. It's kind of always been what they've done. But that's just my opinion on this, on the thing that started. Let's look at some of these other comments. So this guy named Boohoo says, it definitely is because of what was keeping a big part of the player base playing was the story. which is now done, so people are no longer as invested in the story, and therefore many things that were forgiven because of an amazing story are now being brought forwards as problems. Yes, indeed, as we just explained. Ending an arc is fine, starting the next arc on the wrong foot is devastating. I couldn't agree more with that. The game is also boring as fuck and follows the same formula. I've been saying this, that the formula has to change for probably 4 or 5 years. I was shouting it at the rooftops before I quit, but it obviously fell on deaf ears. Let's move on to some more comments. Deserved. The writers need to be replaced after Dawntrail. Not only the writers, the entire game is stale as fuck. The story can get 10 times better, but we would still be stuck with the same repetitive contents, boring quest structure, and non-interactive open world. The game needs to undergo a fundamental overhaul if it wants to stay relevant for the next 10 years. Now, the biggest thing I pulled out of this comment was where this final person said, non-interactive open world. Final Fantasy XIV has never been one. Neither has really WoW outside of once it left vanilla era. Theme park MMOs by default are not interactive open worlds. It's just not how they're designed. It's one of their biggest design flaws, as you can see from another video I did where I'm talking about the upcoming game Ashes of Creation and sandbox MMOs. Feel free to watch those. They're up on the screen now. But I digress. Let's move on to the next comment. Okay. Now this one was a long thread, and I really enjoyed this section. I thought there were a lot of good points in it, so let's just go over it and let's see what it says. I'm not sure if I feel vindicated because of complaining about it since Shadowbringers. While people were pretending the game was in a perfect spot as the best MMO ever, literally nothing changed since then, aside from a 2-minute meta, one bad X.0 story, and slower patches. Okay, that's true. Same boat, but Shadowbringers / End of Heavensward for me. The endgame was always 4 raids for months at a time and a bunch of casual content on the side, and equipment as a whole was just stat improvements. I cannot get excited for a noun tunic of roll with bigger number. The game tailors too much for the casual audience, which isn't bad per se, but I lost interest and kept seeing how they made more choices for that audience, easier jobs, etc., instead of adding more interesting changes. Fair enough. Something that really annoys me about it is that Final Fantasy XIV has 2 difficulty levels, numbingly easy and soul-crushingly hard. There's nothing in between whatsoever. I don't consider myself a hardcore raider, but the normal dungeons are also way too damn easy, and normal raids are just straight up, while extreme unreals are way too big of a difficulty gap. Oh, a slight step up. My bad. Yeah. This is true too, and something I actually haven't pointed out, but I've known. It really is brain dead easy or anus clenching hard on most of the content. That is true. It also consists of fighting a boss for 99% of raids and primal fights, and if someone misses a mechanic, you wipe. It's a team choreography game. 100%. Everybody do your dance. It's like professional ballroom dancing. It's definitely not appealing to me personally. Final Fantasy XI had Dynamis, which was a timed instance of pulls and boss, overworld bosses, some content where you had to unlock equipment slots to stat up. From 14, I only remember Palace of the Dead as something challenging other than raids, and even then it was not that much. When you simplify jobs so much, you remove the possibility of more varied approaches, and we end up with this. Yeah, that's what happens when everything gets so homogenized. The type of hard always put me off over the years for a few reasons. 1, the classes have become largely homogenized, so group composition barely matters. The gear doesn't matter in terms of clearing raid content. Funnily enough, there's more concrete gear progression in DOL and DOH classes, okay? There's only one optimal way to play classes. For example, each samurai plays like the next. So what's left to pump up the difficulty of encounters to extreme / unreal levels? Group coordination and encounter memorization with increasingly complex, misleading tales over ever-increasing encounter lengths. Not exactly my idea of a good time. Yeah, I mean, even when I played WoW, I thought like there was several end bosses that were 15-minute long fights, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And Final Fantasy XIV, the fact that most raid tiers are only 4 bosses, and then you get also an extreme or 2 on top of them for a long period of time for gear that doesn't matter, I think is really starting to wake up some people, if you know what I mean. And now for my absolute favorite comment. I remember that you just couldn't state this without being massively downvoted near the end of Endwalker. I mean, if you've watched my content for any reasonable amount of time, I've talked about this many times. There's another YouTube creator who's long since gone, doesn't really do YouTube anymore, named Link Scamelli, who said the same thing. But for the longest time, Final Fantasy XIV's community was very, very, very toxic and very aggressively hateful towards anyone who said anything critical of the game. Every time I release a video about Final Fantasy XIV, I get the most god-awful hate comments and emails, DMs, and that sort of thing. It's like a cult almost. I've said this many times, if anyone criticizes something you love, whether it be anything, a game, any hobby, a movie, a book, if you take their criticism or dislike of what you like as a personal attack, there's no easier way to put it. You're fucking retarded, and you need help. But let's move on from that. And yeah, now I think people are starting to wake up because they can't hide behind the good story anymore.
And that's meaning, that's awful in the most fundamental sense, but you need an antidote to suffering, and it has to be deep. And deep moves you tectonically, and it's not a trivial thing.
So the new question is now, what can Square do to turn this ship around? Well, we have to remember, and I think a lot of people forget this, that even A Realm Reborn was built on the bones of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, which was an utter failure and disaster. And I've said it many times, what Yoshi P was able to change it into and what Square did to revive this game was nothing short of a miracle. And I had a lot of fun times in Final Fantasy XIV, especially in ARR and Heavensward. But at this point, I think that Yoshi P is tired and overworked, and as far as Dawntrail is concerned, there kind of is no fixing it. They're too deep in on this specific expansion. They need to get to the next expansion as soon as possible, and the entire gear system and every endgame system needs a complete rework and overhaul. The choices that their main story writers are making also need to be heavily examined, and people that are not contributing well and have bad ideas need to be removed. And maybe it's time for a new director and a completely new direction for the game. That's one possible solution. The only other option I can see at this point is to put the game into maintenance mode, and if Square wants to stay in the MMORPG space, to start working on the next major Final Fantasy MMO title built on an entirely new engine, one that isn't hamstrung by what Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was. Now, to be honest, the latter option I definitely do not see happening, but I know that if Square does the same things they're doing now, and when the next expansion is announced, it's the same shit that we have seen for the last decade, i.e. no changes to any of the systems, and just announcing that they're adding a new 8-man raid, new extremes, new 24-man raids, new MSQ, and a new job or two, alongside some pretty artwork and a nifty cinematic trailer, then Final Fantasy XIV is doomed, and will continue to decline until it practically goes free to play. So the choice is pretty much up to them of what they want to do. But anyway, guys, those have been my thoughts about what we're seeing about Final Fantasy XIV. Now, as I said earlier, I don't get pleasure out of shitting on the game, and I was trying to bring these points up in videos and streams and comments on, threads for years, because I cared about the game. And when you care about something, you only want it to get better. Now, I probably will never play Final Fantasy XIV again. I mean, after the final arc in Endwalker, I was satisfied with the story and was burnt out. And the game as an MMO, most theme park games I disliked, but Final Fantasy XIV just didn't provide me anything I was looking for in an MMO. And I've come to find out more recently, after playing like the Ashes Alpha, that sandbox is kind of where my heart is, and I think it's a better overall MMO design. But that's neither here nor there. I want to know, what are your thoughts? If you're part of the Church of Yoshi P and you're pissed, please comments down below. Do you still play the game? Do you have hope for it? What avenue would you like to see Square take if you want to stay playing the game, or have you already quit or are planning to quit? Comments down below. Guys, I really, really appreciate all the support I've been getting and the new subs. My goal for 2025 is to get my total subs on YouTube up to 10K. So I'm putting out a lot more content. I'm streaming again, and a full stream schedule will be up in January. But I try to stream as often as possible for now. And I stream both here on YouTube and at Twitch simultaneously. So whichever platform you prefer, you can go and check. You can come watch, and we can shoot the shit and talk about anything. Some of the shit we've talked about is so deranged, and I have PTSD. Anyway, guys, thanks so much. Take care, and as always, keep it real.